Hi everybody, thank you very much for coming to the Holocaust Centre today. I'd like to welcome Professor Browning and his wife Jenny, who are here. I think it's your third time back at the Holocaust Centre, and everybody here was very excited to listen to you. So Professor Browning probably needs no introduction. He has written 8 books. He is I think he's the preeminent Holocaust historian in the world today. So I'm really excited about it. He is visiting professor for the Aftermath Jan Ronda lecture series. He's a guest of Monash University's Australian Centre for Jewish Civilization. And he is the Frank Porter Graham Professor Emeritus at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And he lives now in Tacoma, Washington. He's the author, as I said, of 8 books on Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. The one we're going to be talking about today is Ordinary Men. Professor Browning has served as an expert witness in war crimes trials in Australia, Canada, Great Britain. He served as an expert witness in 2 Holocaust denial cases, including Irving's libel suit against Deborah Lipstadt in 2000. So the idea for today is for Professor Browning to talk to you a little bit about Ordinary Men, but not necessarily the book. Most of you may have read the book, but it's actually what he's found in the 25 years since the book was published. What has he learnt? What has he discovered? What has he, anything new? So there's a new afterward if you want to get a copy of the new edition. And after Professor Browning's spoken about that, we're handing it over to you to ask any questions that you feel are relevant that you would like to ask. So could you please welcome Professor Browning?
Thank you very much, Sue. Let me very briefly go through what I thought were the main conclusions of Ordinary Men, which was published in 1992, now 27 years ago, and then go through some of the major criticisms of that and where I think perpetrator research, particularly on the face-to-face killers, stands today. I came across the police records of Reserve Police Battalion 101 in the late 1980s and worked through the 210 testimonies that the investigators had taken in preparing the trial, and that, of course, was the basis of the book. And the main conclusions I drew at the time, first was that as far as the membership of the battalion was, this was even, I might say, less than a random selection of Germans. That is, if you were looking for the group of Germans least likely to become mass killers on the part of the Nazi regime, it would be people like those in Reserve Police Battalion 101. What I mean by that is that they had 3 qualifications that should have made it less likely that they would have participated than others in Germany. One by age. These were middle-aged Germans. Average age of the battalion in 42 was 39 and a half years old. So they were too young to have been veterans of World War I, no brutalization by the war in the trenches. Too old to have been in Hitler schools, in Hitler Youth. That is, their formative period was in the Weimar democracy. They are not raised in the Hitler bubble of Hitler Youth and Nazi curricula in the schools. They knew a different world. They had been raised in a democracy. And so they had other standards by which to measure what was going on. They came from the city of Hamburg, which the Nazis derisively referred to as Red Hamburg, because it was a city where the Nazis had not done very well. It was one where the socialist and communist parties had been stronger, where the labor union movement had been stronger, all elements that were less seduced, we should say, by the Nazi appeal than other groups in Germany. And most of them were unskilled German working class. In 1942, they were not drafting skilled laborers making submarines in the port of Hamburg. They were drafting dock workers, truck drivers, warehouse workers, restaurant waiters, and this kind of thing, who up until then had been considered too old for compulsory wartime service, but were now conscripted. So there's no volunteering here. They're drafted, but were too old for the German army, but nonetheless not too old to do some kind of wartime duty. So that's why they're put into this reserve police battalion of the police, not the army, to do far behind the lines activities where it was presumed it would not be so physically strenuous. So by the social class they come from, the working class, by the city they come from, geographically Hamburg, by age, these were groups that were less than average random selection. These are how you would, if you're trying to find the group least likely to become Hitler's killers, you would have stacked the deck in this way. And of course, another factor that made this an important case study was that there was a clear, unequivocal offer of choice. From the very beginning, the major gives everyone the option not to participate in shooting. No one is punished if they do not shoot. No officer can compel any of the men to kill. So that we have here a case where other factors than what were constantly claimed after the war, compelling orders, dire threat of punishment if they didn't do what they were told, do not apply. And I argued in the book that in the initial massacre, for which the men had received virtually no preparation, these had not been men who had had a long period of training, these had not received much indoctrination. They were pulled together in the spring of '42, sent to Poland in the last week of June, and on July 13th, 3 weeks after they arrive, they are suddenly and without preparation thrown into their first massacre at the village of Józefów. The experience is traumatic. The initial reaction of the men is that they are distraught, they're traumatized, they're upset. But the sad news is that thereafter, how quickly they become habituated to what they're doing, how quickly killing becomes routine. And the battalion, I argued, broke into roughly 3 groups. One group was a group of men who I called the eager killers, the people that learned to enjoy killing other human beings. Now that was not a majority, it's a segment of the battalion, obviously one that would have an impact on the battalion beyond their numbers, because of course they are the ones that are given free rein, in a sense, to indulge themselves in an atmosphere where killing is not only allowed, but encouraged. There was a second group that I called the accommodators, the ones that followed orders but didn't volunteer or seek opportunities to kill, but would never take up the major's option and invoke his offer. They would kill when they were asked to, even if they didn't volunteer. And there were a third group I called the evaders, people who at the beginning or later at some point took up the major's offer and said, I don't want to shoot anymore. And thereafter, they would not kill people at point-blank range, but they would still do all the other activities of the battalion that made the killing possible. They would still round up people in the ghettos, they would still march people to the trains, they would still provide the cordons around the shooting sites, so that they would do everything except the last act of killing, which was to put their gun to the head of a victim lying on the ground and pull the trigger. For those who did not involve themselves in the killing, or those who eventually sought to evade, they would, if they were in the non-killing activities, that is, how they spoke about roundups and doing the cordon duty, it's amazing how just the slightest distance from the actual killing, how the slightest division of labor, where somebody else is actually pulling the trigger, seem to have an extraordinary sense of mitigation. That is how quickly people can distance themselves from the moral responsibility of what's going on if they even separate themselves from the actual killing, actual pulling of the trigger by even a few yards. They can be at the killing site, they can be guarding the killing site, but if they're not actually pulling the trigger, they speak about the events as an observer, not as a participant. And those that chose to evade did so not, of course, by challenging the regime, not by denouncing what the battalion was doing, which would have been dangerous, but by accepting the stigma of being too weak. The way in which you created the space to both not participate in the shooting, but not alienate your comrades, not reproach them, and not criticize the regime, was not to say the killing is wrong, it was to say I am too weak to do it, which perversely and inversely, of course, validated the toughness of the people who were killing, sets them up as the model to be emulated, but they took on themselves the onus of being too weak to do that. And that, in a sense, is how they both preserved their relations with their comrades while at the same time not engaging in the actual pulling of the trigger. Having sort of created that narrative, I then invoked a number of insights we get from social sciences, the notion of Milgram's experiment on deference to authority, how people in groups tend to defer to those with authority, the importance of conformity. One of the major ways in which people's behavior in groups are shaped is by conforming to the norms of the group, not sticking out as being contrary. And another was what we call role adaptation. Put people into a new role, put them in a uniform, and people who, as a regular civilian, would never think of doing something, put them into a uniform of a soldier and place them in occupied territory, and they will behave in a very different way. And Zimbardo was the one who did the famous Stanford prison experiment on people who role-played prison guards and how that influenced their behavior. Solomon Asch was the one who did the experiments on conformity. So I basically took as, in a sense, my premise that what was important here in looking at the behavior of the battalion was not that we were looking at a bunch of individual psychopaths who are individually psychologically abnormal. We were looking at a group of normal people, and what was key was to understand what it was about group interaction. What was it about the dynamic of group behavior that could explain why normal or ordinary men would, in certain circumstances, behave in such extraordinary ways. And that basically was the argument of the book. Now, what was the reaction? Well, for the most part, it was fairly well received. But there were a number of criticisms, some more justified than others, that have helped us, I think, refine how we think about the problem of Holocaust perpetrators. And of course, history is an ongoing process. When I wrote the book in 1992, in a sense, it was to start a conversation, not to end one. And indeed, any historian who writes a book that continues to be debated later is basically doing what we're trying to do. We don't pretend to have all the answers, but we are trying to stimulate the discussion, the ongoing search, and help us to refine new questions that hadn't occurred to us earlier. So this was really the first history of an individual killing unit that could work with materials from the men. And since then, scholarship has, I think, continued. And so what I want to do now is go over some of the issues that were raised and where I think those criticisms were justified and where they were not. One criticism was my use of social psychology. And social psychologists themselves are aware of the fact that most people think of social psychological explanations as exculpatory, as removing individual responsibility from people. The social scholars don't agree with that, but they know that that's how what they do is perceived. And indeed, one of the criticisms of the book was my citing of social psychological insights and experiments was somehow alleviating the guilt of the men, was somehow exculpatory in terms of their responsibility for their own actions. That somehow if you were responding to peer pressure, that was, in the eyes of my critics at least, somehow removing from these men their own power of decision. I think that is wrong. I think it's wrong for the following reasons. In each of these experiments, Milgram's experiment with deference to authority, the Zimbardo experiment with role adaptation, the prison guards, Asch's experiment with people who conform to what they know is a wrong statement that everyone else in the room is supporting. There are, in each of the experiments, a certain number of people that do not comply. That is, we know 2/3 of the people in the Milgram experiment, when it's repeated, routinely will inflict the highest levels of punishment. But 1/3 do not. So that we know people are capable of making their own decisions. What these experiments would show is what percentage of people are likely to take that decision in one direction as opposed to the minority that will make the opposite decision. But the experiment simply measures what is the total of a series of individual decisions. Everybody in those experiments, just as everybody in Reserve Police Battalion 101, made a decision for themselves. And that decision involved their own human responsibility, how they were going to behave and treat others. And the fact that 2/3 made the wrong decision in the Milgram experiments, or 70 to 80% made the wrong decision in 101, does not mean that we are alleviating those people of the responsibility for the choice that they made, because we know they could have chosen differently because some did. And so I don't accept the criticism that invoking social psychological insights, I am somehow removing moral responsibility from the participants. A second criticism of the book was that as a case study it was, quote, atypical. Reserve Police Battalion 101 was not like most German killing units, and therefore the conclusions I drew cannot be generalized. And their argument was that even if my portrayal of 101 was right, most German killing units were carefully selected, were highly indoctrinated, did have high percentages of Nazi and SS party membership, were engaged in prior activities that brutalized them, and in a sense they were all carefully selected, carefully trained, and carefully prepared for what they did. As the article of one article that set up this was ideological soldiers or ordinary men. And the conclusion was most of the killers in most of the killing units were ideological warriors, that they were out doing this as conscious Nazis, not as randomly selected middle-aged working class people from Hamburg. Fortunately now, one of the things that the book did cause was a lot of other police battalions got researched. Up to that point, we didn't know hardly anything about these units. Now we have studies of a number of them. And one can say, yes, Reserve Police Battalion 101 was atypical. It's atypical in the following way, that there are in fact 3 different kinds of police battalions. The first kind were made up of people who volunteered for the police reserve between 37 and 39. They were usually in their late 20s or early 30s at that point, so about 10 years younger than the men of 101. They would do their summer camp. They would go weekends of instruction, and then when World War breaks out in September 1939, they are fully mobilized, put through a long period of additional training, and then sent out to the occupied territories where they learn how to act like the master race ruling over Germany's conquered and occupied territories and subject peoples. So they have a long period which they, have mostly volunteered for what they're in, a long period of indoctrination and training, a prior period of brutal occupation duties before they're ever sent to start carrying out mass killings. A second group were people who were not drafted, but selected in 1939 to 40. These were younger yet. These were people in their mid to late 20s. When the war breaks out, the military goes to the German police and says, we want a bunch of your professional policemen, career policemen, to be drafted and transferred to the army as military police, what the Germans called the Feldgendarmerie, field police. And they said, in return, we will allow you to select from the pool of people that have volunteered for military service to choose who you would like and to put them into the police instead. And so the second cohort of police are younger, and they're carefully selected. You have a whole group of people to choose from. Again, a much higher level of Nazification. These are people who were raised in the Nazi bubble. They've been in Hitler schools. They've been in the Hitler Youth. and certainly their percentage of Nazi Party membership was much higher. Both of those were the first and the second kinds of police battalions. The third kind is like 101, that it had existed as the first kind until 42. Its membership was then sent out and dispersed to other units to be the cadres, the sergeants and corporals of new battalions. And Police Battalion 101 is filled with these middle-aged reservists who don't have special indoctrination, don't have training, don't have high Nazi membership or SS membership, and as I say, are thrown into Poland with virtually no preparation and are sent to begin mass killing almost immediately. So 101 is atypical, but I would argue that's going to in fact enhance, not detract from my argument that ordinary people can be induced to do this very quickly. Of all the German police battalions we now have, we can rank them by how lethal they were. We know what their body counts were. And of the 110 German police battalions, 101, who doesn't even come to the killing fields until a year later, until July 1942, so they're a year behind many others. Nonetheless, and they're sent to Poland, further away from the Soviet Union, and nonetheless, over the course of the war, established himself with the fourth highest killing rate of any police battalion. They have the fourth highest body count of any battalion in the German police, which means to say that you don't have to have special selection. You don't have to have special indoctrination. You don't have to have special training. You don't have to have lots of Nazis and SS within the unit to turn it into a very lethal killing battalion. So it may not be typical, but that is not good news. That does not cause for us to feel somehow that the lesson of 101 is somehow less dire because it wasn't a typical German killing unit. In fact, I think it makes it even more scary in terms of what it did given its composition. Another criticism that was made of the book was that I gave insufficient attention to ideology, to the man's mindset, that I focused on what were called the situational factors and not enough to the ideological factors. This, of course, was the main criticism of Daniel Goldhagen, who wrote a book that was kind of monocausal in saying that German eliminationist anti-Semitism was the only necessary and sufficient cause to explain the behavior of the men. And I argued for a multi-causal explanation in which I did focus more on situation than on ideology, but I certainly did not exclude it. But because he attacked from one side, my book always got put in the other. This was the battle of the books was seen, the battle between the ideological anti-Semitic explanation and the situational explanation invoking social psychological factors. That's how the two, in a sense, got seen in a kind of false binary because of the direction from which Goldhagen's attack came. One of the most insightful contributions that came out after my book and after his book, that is after 1992 and 1996, was by a social psychologist named Leonard Newman. And he argued that what was being explained as a battle between an ideological explanation and a situational explanation was a false dichotomy. Because there is no such thing as a kind of a tabula rasa, a kind of clear table situation in which people find themselves. That you cannot have situation apart from ideology because the situation people are in are interpreted by them, understood by them, constructed by them, depending upon the assumptions that they bring with them. They see what they see through particular glasses of the culture that they're raised in, what their assumptions are about how the world works. So that a German coming to Poland in 1942 has to be shaped by his views about what people's obligations are in war when you put on a uniform, about what his culture's dismissive views are about Poles and Jews and people of Eastern Europe, as well as more general social psychological factors, such as its response to issues of conformity, deference to authority, role adaptation, and so on. So Newman was saying you simply don't have a situation that is not culturally constructed. That is, the situation you are in is understood by the individual in it, in part dependent on the cultural glasses through which he's looking. So you never have a neutral situation that is impacted by ideology. You have a situation that is constructed and understood in part by the culture of the people that are in it. Let me give you an example. So take the Milgram experiment, where you have a scientist in a white coat and a clipboard invoking all the authority of science in order to induce people to defer to him as the scientific authority when he conducts that experiment. And indeed, if there's sort of one consensus, one might say, of modern Western life, we generally defer to, respect science, think that science, in fact, has been essential to our progress. Take someone from the uplands of New Guinea who doesn't know what science is, and put him in that chair and say, you must do this for the sake of scientific progress, and he does not have the cultural equipment to interpret that situation in the way a Western man would. It won't make any sense to him. And he will see that situation in an utterly different way because he comes out of an utterly different culture. So clearly, people's behavior in situations will depend upon the cultural assumptions that they bring with him. And I think that was very important because it prevents us from making this false division between cultural factors and situational factors. They are, in fact, inevitably going to be a blend. A fourth criticism that was made of the book was quite simply that I'd been duped by my sources. I was reading the 210 interrogations. These policemen had every reason, in addition to the frailties of human memory, they had every reason to lie, to distort, to evade, and to forget or cover up various things they had done. And so certainly the criticism of Daniel Goldhagen was that I basically had been too trusting of my sources, I had been suckered by my sources, and that he had not. And so let's look at this issue of the sources and which ones I used, which ones he did, and then try to see if we can test that. I would argue these sources really, that is the policeman's testimonies, were divided into kind of three kinds. One kind of testimony was just so transparently mendacious, so clearly lying that no reasonable person would trust the person talking. Many of the officers in that battalion, for instance, would simply deny even the most fundamental things that had happened in the battalion to which everyone else had testified, and they just lied totally. Neither Goldhagen or I would use those sources. Some people gave such searingly self-incriminating testimony that there's no way they would have given that testimony falsely. I mean, here they were saying things, such terrible things about what they did and what their comrades did, that we will trust that testimony because it's almost inconceivable somebody would self-incriminate themselves in that way if they had not, in fact, done that. But then there's a whole middle band of testimony which tells part of the truth, part of the time. And the question is there, what do you do with it? Goldhagen's argument was any testimony that had the potential to be self-exculpatory, you had to discard. The main thing was to never take anything that was even had a suspicion of its being self-exculpatory. You wanted to stay only with the testimonies in which, as he put it, the people giving them admitted they had given themselves to Hitler, mind, body, and soul. I said many of these testimonies tell us all sorts of things about what the battalion did, even if they don't tell us what the individual himself did. They, as I say, tell part of the truth, part of the time, but they talk about what the battalion did in very important, informative ways, even if they're not totally honest about their own participation. And learning what the battalion did is what this is about. My book is not about who can I indict and put in jail individually. It's about what was the behavior of the battalion. And information of this kind that the middle band of testifiers are giving, I think was absolutely essential. And really it's because I used that kind of testimony, and Goldhagen did not, that I had a much broader spectrum of behavior, a much broader gray areas, we might say, in the battalion, while he portrayed it as kind of 95% of these people were, quote, the eager killers. Now, my argument to his methodology is this. If your hypothesis is that virtually everybody in this battalion were convinced German anti-Semites who thought it was right to kill Jews and wanted to kill Jews and did so enthusiastically, and the only testimony you use is people that confess to that, then you have a methodology that can do no other than confirm the hypothesis the evidence is supposed to test. That is, if you eliminate any possible contrary evidence as self-exculpatory, you have a closed circle. Here is my hypothesis. I will only use the evidence consistent with that hypothesis. My hypothesis is proven. Very convenient, but I don't think that that is a academically valid methodology, because any methodology that can't allow for the possibility of disproving itself basically is a rigged game. So let's look at two cases where my conclusion is starkly different from his, but we can find evidence of other kinds, other than the policemen's testimonies, to see whether my conclusions were in fact not just being duped by the policeman, but in fact I had read the evidence correctly. One such thing is, did the men undergo a rapid transformation? I said they were traumatized the first day. And one of the most worrisome conclusions I drew is how quickly people who come to the killing fields as ordinary men are so quickly turned into hardened, routinized killers, and how quickly they can be brutalized by what they are doing and what they are seeing. They're not killing, they didn't come to the fields eager to kill, but they are turned into hardened killers in a remarkably short period of time. How can we test that proposition other than the testimony of the policemen themselves? One source is to look at contemporary letters that people write. And now we don't have a series of letters from 101. We do have a series of letters of a policeman in a neighboring battalion, Battalion 105 from Bremen. Bremen and Hamburg, very similar cities, both on the Baltic, both basically North German Lutheran commercial cities, very much the same kinds of city. Reserve Police Battalion 105 was sent into Lithuania in June of 1941, and the company photographer of Company 3 in Battalion 105 wrote to his wife every week. And that series of letters has been preserved. We have the record that can show how he changes over time. So let me just give you a few excerpts to try to illustrate my point. That in fact people can be drastically transformed by what they are doing. They don't have to come to the killing fields as brutal killers in order to be turned into brutal killers. June 24, this is 2 days after the outbreak of the war, his battalion is about to cross into Lithuania. This is when units had what were called the secret orders. They were not to be put in writing because they didn't want any German soldier captured to have this on him. So each of the units before they cross into the Soviet Union is given an oral pep talk by their commanding officer with the so-called secret orders, such as captured communists are to be killed immediately. They're not to be treated as prisoners of war, collective retaliation against villages where there's resistance, and these kinds of things. And so he writes to his wife, June 24. The major said that every suspect is to be shot immediately. Well, I'm in suspense. These gentlemen fancy themselves very important and martial. He thinks they're putting on a show. He thinks they're stage acting a kind of toughness, and he doesn't understand that this is going to be a very different kind of war. He had previously, this unit had been in Norway. I mean, this was the cushiest assignment you could get in the German army, was to be occupied Norway. And now they're being sent into Lithuania. They get into a small town in Lithuania where the battalion temporarily stops. They take their lodging, of course, from whatever house in the village they want. And they're all grabbing Jews to be their personal servants. And so he writes here on June 27th, "The Jews are free game. Anybody can seize one on the streets for himself. I would not like to be in a Jew's skin." You notice nobody will sell them or give them food. Quote, "How they actually live, I don't know. We give them our bread and more. I cannot be so tough." So that's on July 7th. Exactly 1 month later, by the time they're deeper into Lithuania, this is when the systematic mass killing is just beginning in this region. He writes to his wife, quote, first of all, he writes about how all the food he's pillaged he's sending home, and he hopes that his mother and them all enjoy it, good appetite. And after wishing them a good appetite on their stolen food, he writes this, "Here all the Jews are being shot. Everywhere such actions are underway. Yesterday night, 150 Jews from this place were shot, men, women, children, all killed. The Jews are being totally exterminated." He writes on to his wife to say nothing about it to their child. So he knows that something is happening that he isn't proud of. He doesn't want his wife to talk about it to the children. And he says, say nothing about it to the child. But it is still in you can see, he says, here they are all being shot. It's not I'm shooting them. It's not my unit is shooting them. It's not that we're shooting them. Here they're all being shot. After the war, of course, almost all German testimony is put in this anonymous passive. Somehow all the Jews just got killed. Who did it? Oh, some unit. They were all shot. What we see here is immediately, at the very point the killing begins, the Germans are already talking about this in the anonymous passive. It's happening without them associating or identifying themselves as the agents of it. As they go deeper into the Baltic, they pass many of the POW camps. Some of you may know that the mass deaths from Russian prisoners of war, that is, they penned them up and didn't feed them. Up until the spring of '42, the number of Russian POWs who died under the Nazis still exceeded the number of Jews being killed. It's not until the spring of '42 that the mass killing of Jews exceeds that of prisoners of war. In the fall of 1941, he writes, he's now telling his wife he can't send them back any more food because the Soviets are practicing scorched earth. They're destroying everything that they would leave behind. And he's angry. He doesn't get to loot anymore. And he writes, "For their own prisoners must go hungry. Yes, that is quite clear. When one sees a prisoner, a prison camp, one can see miserable scenes. The people would be better off dead. That is, they're just starving to death right before his eyes." Then as they get deeper, there's some partisan resistance. They begin to use words about the Russians as, quote, beasts, dogs, trashed. He's the company photographer. He misses an execution, and he laments. He's sorry he couldn't photograph it. Quote, "It was said to have been fun." Next, they managed, one of their own policemen is killed by a sniper, and he writes that his comrades are all angry. They would, quote, "like best of all to shoot down all Russians." Killing all the Jews isn't enough. They'd like to kill all the Russians. And then finally, he writes to his wife that there was another execution. This time he did get it on his film. And he writes, "In the future, my film will be a document and of great interest for our children." Now, I would suggest that demonstrates about a quick, rapid degeneration, or a quick and rapid and total transformation of somebody in their own words, written at that time. I didn't make this up after the war. I wasn't duped into that conclusion by lying policemen. This is the letters of a German policeman at the time, writing then, and you can see in his own words what an extraordinary process of degeneration that takes place in a very short period. A second conclusion I drew, as I said earlier, is I thought that the battalion roughly broke into three groups: the eager killers, the accommodators, and the evaders. And I ventured that the evaders could have been between 10 and as high as 20%. And Goldhagen's response is that's totally impossible. The battalion could never have functioned as a killing unit if 20% of the men had evaded. He didn't cite an authority for that. He simply announced that as self-evident and obvious. What evidence do we have about what the spectrum of people was in a killing unit and whether or not that affected their killing mission? We have a very interesting case of a police station in the town of Mir in Belarus. And this comes, what we know about it is from a man named Oswald Rufeisen. Now, Oswald Rufeisen is very important. One is because he's Jewish, so our witness is going to be a Jew who has no reason to cover for or lie about German perpetrators. Oswald Rufeisen was born in Silesia, so unlike Jews in central Poland and further east, he speaks Polish and German both without an accent. Yiddish is not his native tongue. So unlike many Jews further east, if they opened their mouth and spoke Polish, every Pole around them immediately knows their Jewish identity. Oswald Rufeisen could pass as a German or a Pole. When the Germans come into Silesia, he flees to Lithuania. In 1941, when the Germans come to Lithuania, he flees south from Vilna into what is now present-day Belarus. He's a 17-year-old kid, and he's intercepted outside of Mir by the local police captain, a man named Simeon Serafimovich. And Simeon Serafimovich demands his papers. And the 17-year-old Oswald Rufeisen says, my papers have been stolen, which is not implausible in the chaos of this. And so Serafimovich says, who are you? And he says, well, I'm a refugee. I come from Silesia. I have a German father and a Polish mother. And he speaks Polish and German, both without an accent, very plausible. And of course, he's hiding his Jewish identity. And Serafimovich says, well, that's convenient because the Germans are coming to set up a police station and I need a German translator. Because Serafimovich does not speak German. He speaks Belarusian and Polish. So Serafimovich says, you will come home and live with me. And so the 17-year-old Oswald Rufeisen takes up a room in the attic of the Belarusian police captain. 2 weeks later, the Germans arrive. Who are the Germans? 13 reserve policemen, middle-aged, from northern Germany, exactly like the people in Reserve Police Battalion 101, under Sergeant Hein. Of course, Sergeant Hein has to meet with Serafimovich. They meet, and Sergeant Hein immediately takes a liking to the translator. And he says, you're going to come work for me. So Oswald Rufeisen, the 17-year-old Jew passing as a half-German, half-Pole, lives at night in the house of the Belarusian police captain, and by day sits at the right hand of Sergeant Hein and conducts all of his business with the native population that requires a translator. He has an inside look for 8 months at the entire dynamics and the workings of this German unit of reserve policemen from northern Germany. Now, in the end, Oswald Rufeisen is denounced in a surprising way. Of course, the Jews in the ghetto in Mir do not know he's Jewish. After all, he's working in the police station of the Germans. He comes to warn them that the liquidation of the ghetto is imminent and they should run to the forest. Someone in the ghetto thinks he's a provocateur trying to trick them into doing something that will give the Germans the pretext to kill them, and they denounce him to Sergeant Hein. Your translator there is coming and telling us that you're going to come and liquidate the ghetto. Sergeant Hein calls Rufeisen in and says to him, why did you betray me? I've been so nice to you. And Rufeisen says, sir, you have to understand I didn't betray you, I'm a Jew. And Hein says, oh, that's a problem. And Sergeant Hein then quite deliberately says, you sit here, wait for me, I have to go think about this, leaves the office, the back window is open, and of course, Oswald Rufeisen bolts, escapes into the forest, is hidden in a monastery, survives the war. Now, I know Oswald Rufeisen because we both were witnesses at the Serafimovich trial, magistrate's hearing in England in the 1990s. So not only has Nahama Tech written a whole book about Rufeisen, but I've met him twice, and we talked about this story as well. In any case, what did Rufeisen say about the nature of the police unit in Mir? And he writes, I'm happy to say, that it basically broke into 3 groups. And he says one group were the eager killers. This were the people who were the 4 people who were the clique of Corporal Schultz. Corporal Schultz is the archetypal eager killer. He carried a notebook in his back pocket where he kept his body count. And by the summer of 1942, when Rufeisen escapes, he had already killed 80 people. And that did not include children. He didn't waste his time marking the children. Those were 80 adults that he had killed. So there's a group of 4 out of 13 that are the eager killers. They are then a group of non-participants, the evaders. And again, this is a group of 4 out of 13. And he writes, none seemed to bother them. No one talked about their absences. It was as if they had a right to abstain. So it wasn't just Trump in 101, but in fact here too, a battalion commander who simply didn't force people to participate if they did not want to. And then there's the middle group, who Rufeisen described as, quote, the passive executors of orders, what I call the accommodators. And he writes, quote, it was clear that there were differences in their outlooks. I think that the whole business of Jewish extermination they considered unclean. The operations against the partisans were not in the same category. For them, a confrontation with partisans was a battle, a military move. But a move against the Jews was something they might have experienced as dirty. So here we have a case where there's no reason to lie, no reason to cover up for the Germans, in which Rufeisen confirms my interpretation of the testimony and not the one given by Daniel Goldhagen. So those have been sort of the major criticisms. That's where I think things went in the first decade, we might say, after the book was published. Where have they gone from there? I would say 2 things. I would just cite, in a sense, two important developments since then. One is people who've gone beyond looking at the social psychological factors that I had, conformity, deference to authority, role adaptation, and tried to explain what had happened, not just in the unit, but more widely in German society, as a, quote, moral revolution. That is, how did the moral norms of reference get changed and transformed so that Germans basically, and this I'll use the phrase of Helen Fine, who wrote a book about comparative genocide, about how people expelled others from the, quote, community of human obligation. So it wasn't that these people came to the killing fields as anti-Semites eager to kill, but in the course of Nazi Germany, basically learned to consider some human beings as not part of their group, not people to whom they had any moral obligation, that their duty and their obligation is only to their own, only to their inner circle. Everyone else is excluded. And what you do against the others is, in a sense, detached then from moral condemnation. It's not that people enjoyed what they were doing. They considered they had unpleasant, dirty work to do, but they did not consider it a crime or an act of immorality. Those people are sent outside the world of the moral norms that they will apply to fellow Germans, but everyone else. So Roma and Sinti, the physically and mentally handicapped, the asocials, the Jews, a whole vast, the territory, people of occupied territories, basically are simply not part of humanity to which they are included in a world of moral obligation. I use the term dehumanization, but I think this is a much more accurate description of what's happening in that all sorts of groups are simply excluded from their moral calculations or beyond the reach of what they consider people deserving of moral behavior, and what they do to them is, in a sense, not to be measured in terms of crime or immorality. Then Thomas Kuhn at Clark University has also said what the Nazis succeeded in doing was capturing two concepts that have broad resonance in German society, and they managed to appropriate those and to racialize them. And that they, in a sense, captured part of the political discourse for their own purposes that enabled them to, in a sense, have their hooks in the German population over their ability to exploit these particular terms. And one was comradeship, and the other was the Volksgemeinschaft, which is a German word without any adequate translation in English. Under the Nazis, it becomes the racial community as opposed to, we would translate earlier, as the people's community. And let me talk about sort of both those briefly, and then we'll, or do we have enough time, or should we? I'm
sure they want questions as well. So
okay. I'll finish this real quick. The comradeship, of course, came out of World War I, the experience in the trenches. If you read, if you read Markel, Quiet on the Western Front, he says the only, redemptive part of this whole experience was the comradeship. Comradeship, for some, like Remarque, was experienced as the brotherhood of all soldiers suffering. What the Nazis turned it into was the brotherhood of the Germans, and it's a racial group, and again, you're only loyal to your comrades as a racial collective, not as any other kind of category. The Volksgemeinschaft was initially a very inclusive phrase. The beginning of Germany had been very divided and fragmented. In the beginning of World War I, when the war breaks out and there's these huge celebrations because people think it's going to be a nice quick victory parade, Kaiser Wilhelm gives his famous speech from the Reichstag that now he knows no confessions, no parties, no classes, he knows only Germans. And this was kind of a euphoric sense of unity. And this was going to be the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community. What the Nazis were able to do was to take that concept, which had very powerful resonance in Germany, and turn it from the people's community, an inclusive concept, into an exclusive concept, a racial community, Germans versus others. So that's, in a sense, where we stand at the moment. I think it's, history continues, fortunately, to refine and find new sources, ask new questions. And I'm just grateful that Ordinary Men is still, 27 years later, part of that conversation as we hopefully move forward.
Thank you, Professor Browning. I had one question for you, but Oswald Rufeisen became very famous for something else later, correct?
Yes.
So do you know who he was? Does anyone know that name? Do you remember the story of Brother Daniel? Anyone remember? Do you want to tell them?
Yes, when he hides in the monastery in Poland, he converts to Catholicism, and then he is the test case of whether a Jew converted to Christianity has the right of return to the state of Israel. And he moves to Israel. I entered my second meeting when it was in Haifa, just about 6 weeks before he died. So he does go back. He does make aliyah to Israel.
So are there any general questions, comments, anything that you'd like to ask Professor Browning? We've got about 25 minutes. We have a microphone, if you like.
Sure. David Zinger, second generation. It's a comment from my mother, really. So my mother, who was in Auschwitz, would often told me, and she's still alive, but she would often tell me about her experiences, and she would say that when an SS officer was by himself, he could be a human being, but when they were together with at least two of them, they had to perform. And she described many instances where she was actually given some sympathy by an officer and given good advice about how to stay alive. But she would always say when there was more than one, you could only expect punishment, which reinforces your notion of the socialisation of evil.
The group dynamic
Yes.
changes who people are and how they behave.
Absolutely, yeah. And we know that in our daily lives.
Hi, I'm Shirley and I'm second generation as well. Could you clarify for me whether they were volunteers or conscripted, the people?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Whether they were volunteers for the battalions or were they conscripted?
101 are all conscripted.
All conscripted.
Yeah. The earlier police battalions were composed of many people who had volunteered. In fact, but of course that also raises the question in 37 to 39, if you're volunteering for the police, are you volunteering so you don't have to go into the army? So it can mean either you're eager or it can mean you thought this was the lesser evil. So that's still a bit ambivalent because probably people did that for both reasons. But in case of 101, we're talking about the rank and file are all conscripted. The non-commissioned officers are career police who have volunteered for a career in the police long before and worked their way up the ranks. But the rank and file are conscripts.
Did you ever interview anybody later? Did you ever follow up after you'd read all their testimonies?
Yeah. No, that was not possible. One of the conditions of getting into the court records was that I could not use any names or addresses to contact them or their families. Of course, if they were average age of 39 and a half and 42, I was looking at these records in 1989, vast majority of them were already dead. And the rest would have been quite well along. But I was prohibited by German law from using records that I gained when I applied to get clearance to the court records to contact the families in any way. They could contact me, and a few did. I got a phone call from someone in New Jersey who said that his mother had moved to New Jersey in 1955 when he was about 10 years old. He said he never knew his father. He was conceived and his father never came back from the front after whatever his last leave, so he never knew his father. But on reading, they were from Hamburg, and so when he heard about the book and read it, he went up and for the first time looked at the letters his mother had saved from his father, and by the place from which they came, it was clear he was in 101. And so I asked him, well, what did the letters say? And he says, oh, nothing. They say, what do you have to eat, what the weather was. He says, the only interesting sentence in all of the letters was, what we are doing here in Poland is unangenehm. That's the German for unpleasant. That was the only sort of comment that he made. I was contacted by a woman in Germany whose uncle, I guess I had mentioned in it, and he was an uncle without children, so she was kind of the favorite niece, and they had a very close relationship. I had put him in the category of people who had been a non-shooter. And she said, well, you probably should know that he did in fact shoot a Jew and confessed that to me. But then after that experience, he wouldn't do it anymore. So it was one of those cases where the person lied about their own participation, but told the truth about the wider events of the battalion, and did become a non-shooter, having had what was for him the horrific experience of killing another human being, after which he then said no more. A little correspondence with a woman who investigated, I guess, she had I forget what the exact relationship was. She wrote a very important article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine, or maybe Die Zeit. But having read my book when it came out in German, she would then went back and sort of investigated what her family had done, and one of them who had been in 101, who had come back from the war totally different. And she was now looking at why of the two brothers, one went one way and one became so different, and sort of took off from that. Those are the contacts I had, but they had to initiate them. I couldn't go to them.
One of the people in the unit, I remember sort of vaguely, he was a businessman, and he said he didn't want to participate because how it would affect his relationship when he went back. So he seemed more than simply an evader. His comments seemed to be like as if he was protesting about what was happening.
Yeah, Lieutenant Buchmann was the figure. He had the advantage that he had been drafted into 101 and served as Major Tropp's driver while Major Trop was still a captain. And then, because he's middle-class background, which was unusual, and had a higher education, they sent him off to officer training school, and when Major Trop is promoted to major, he comes back as a reserve lieutenant. So he had a personal relationship with Trop that other people in the battalion would not have. And he's the one, when Trop announces at the very beginning to the officers the night before the USS massacre, says, I can't take part in that. And then Trop arranges that he will take the detachment of Jews selected for labor off to a Lublin work camp before the killing begins. And thereafter, Buchmann makes very clear he's not going to participate ever, and that's obvious to everyone in the battalion. And as he put it, some men looked down their nose at me because of it, but others understood and supported me. So again, he had a mixed response from the battalion. He finally writes back and to Berlin and asks to be recalled and to assign to a position back in Hamburg. And the way he explained it in his oral interrogation, which that's what I saw, was that he didn't agree with the non-police functions of the battalion here in Poland. Now, I've been told subsequently by someone who's actually gotten into, which I couldn't do back at that time, gotten into his personal file, that the letter is much more cautious than that. It is not openly critical, but it does ask to be transferred back. When he's not dealing with Major Trop, he apparently was much more careful about not appearing to be in an opposition stance, which he could be more openly in the battalion itself because of his personal relationship to the major.
Hi, Dr. Browning, I'm Karen. I have a question. You categorized the battalion into eager killers, accommodators, and evaders. And then you spoke later about, in taking the testimonies, some lied, denied. See if I can remember this. Some told partial truth, some were self-incriminating. I'm wondering what was the correlation, like what you found in terms of levels of guilt. And were there eager killers who seemed to feel guilt? Were the evaders guilty because perhaps they felt they should have done more, or the accommodators?
I would say what is almost totally absent from the testimony is guilt. Certainly, many of the eager killers we know from the testimony of others are the most lying ones who say they didn't do anything. So if there's a correlation, it was the more you were an eager killer, the more likely you were lying. Though we do get some very searingly self-incriminating testimony, certainly the most prominent officers that were eager killers basically lied through their teeth. What comes out of the testimonies, rather than a sense of guilt, is a sense of self-pity. What comes out of this is, I was so unlucky to get assigned to this battalion and sent to do that dirty duty. And then 20 years later, they changed the rules, and now because I did what I was supposed to do then, I'm in a court of law where they say I'm a criminal now. How unlucky can you get? Poor me. Nothing about the victims. I mean, the victims are, in a sense, to talk what I talk, and the ability to kind of put the victims outside not only their moral world, but to put them outside their world entirely. They simply ceased almost to be a factor. This is all about them. And for them, it is, I'm unlucky. You should feel sorry for me because I really got the wrong end of the straw, not once, but twice.
I'm just wondering if there was any feedback or communication from the families that affected 101 participants.
We have very little information there. A couple of the wives of the officers were interviewed because in Poland, far enough from the front in 42, officers could have family visit. And some of the officers, lieutenants did have wives come out to visit. And so the ones that were known to have visited were in 1962-65, called in and were interrogated about what they remember. One of them was the wife of one of the captains who was just lied through her teeth, and the other was Lucia Boyson, who was in fact a very good witness. She told a lot of very interesting accounts that added an important perspective on how, in even everyday kinds of things, that the Germans behaved. That is, what was the behavior of the master race among these inferior Poles? Such as when you went to a shop, all the Polish were to leave, so you could shop without dirty Poles around you, and things like that. I mean, she just showed what the perspective of a woman in that environment of German domination over a subject population in everyday life was like. And so it was a very fascinating interview that she gave. One other woman was a man who was, in fact, one of the few that was condemned back very early. His wife denounced him, and he was extradited to Poland, and like Major Trop, put on a one-day trial and executed. Her testimony was that, you know, he came back such an utterly different man, you know, wife abuser, basically, that she turned him in. He was so horrible, which was rare. But those were the only family interactions that I saw.
So there wasn't a big enough component or force to change things? It wasn't like a big family pressure?
No.
That could have made a difference.
Well, you know, if they'd been back in Hamburg, I think nobody would have done what they did. But out and isolated in an occupation unit in Poland, who is their family? What is their family? It's the 500 men. And you don't want to be a social pariah in a small group in occupied territory, surrounded by a hostile population, because that's your social world. And so I think, in a sense, the unit becomes the substitute family, and they are important. That's where the peer pressure becomes so intense.
One thing I'd like to ask you about the work you've done generally. Often people say, well, you know, people, guides even here in the Holocaust Museum say, you know, or we have visitors say, how could the Germans have done this because they're such a cultured people and things like that. I've read a couple of sort of books where they reversed the thing, and I can't quote the writers, but their comments have been that German culture led to their behaviour during the Second World War, rather than being a sort of, you know, unusual factor that, you know, these people somehow ended up doing this irrespective of their culture, but reversing that. What's your view on that?
Well, that's this very difficult issue about how we weigh cultural factors against other factors. And I would say two things here. First, when Goldhagen portrayed this and shaped it, this is only Germans behave this way because of particular German cultural factors, and that those factors focus on Jews. So this is strictly to be seen as a German against Jew phenomenon. And of course, the problems we know is that many of the killers were not Germans, and many of the victims weren't Jews. So we have a mass killing phenomenon that includes so much more than what can be explained by Germans, and we have victims, so many more victims that can't be explained by anti-Semitism, that we have to have a broader explanation. The other thing I would point to is, you know, most genocides we simply don't know enough about Stalinist killers. We don't know enough about the killers of Mao's China. We do know, I guess, some at least about Cambodia. But the one that I think where more work has been done, and what I would share with you now, is Rwanda. When I was at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in 2002, 2003, there was a psychiatrist from Rwanda there called Athanase Hagengamano. And I don't expect you to be able to repeat that name. It took me a long time to learn it. But in any case, he was a psychiatrist by training. He was half Hutu, half Tutsi. One of his sisters was in jail as a Hutu genocidaire. One of his sisters had been murdered as a Tutsi. So from his personal background, he just was split down the middle. I mean, he was right in the middle of this fratricidal genocide. At the end of the genocide, he goes first to some of the camps on the border in Uganda where Tutsi had fled, trying to use his his psychiatric training to deal with the trauma of the survivors. But there was also a prison in that town for genocidaires that had been caught. And it occurred to him that at some point that really this was an opportunity for somebody of his training to not just help survivors, but to try to learn more about the killers. So he asked permission to be allowed to go into the prison and to basically conduct a kind of psychiatric survey. And he got that permission, and the first thing he did was set out a questionnaire in which he had every kind of question the first questionnaire basically was to find out how deeply you had been involved in the killing. Who were the real hardcore killers? And clearly some people who were hardcore killers would have hidden that and denied it. What was surprising is how many admitted it, and he had a pool, a fairly decent pool of self-admitted hardcore genocidaires who had been deeply involved in the killing process. To that group, he then submitted a second questionnaire. And the questionnaire composed questions of all kinds. It tried every kind of motive he could think of that would help to explain their behavior. And when he got back the results, he said he had never seen anything like it in his professional experience of doing these kinds of surveys, that virtually every question was a flat line. There's no correlation, except for two clusters of questions that just spiked off the baseline. The first cluster of questions had to deal basically with ideology, namely that they had dehumanized their victims. They did not think of what they were doing as murder of human beings, but cleansing of disease, the disinfecting of insects, the squashing of vermin. I mean, all the vocabulary we know from the Nazis that dehumanized Jews. It's that vocabulary that basically redefines the act of killing not anymore as the murder of human beings, but as a act of basically purification, sanitation, and that sort of thing. So it redefines, this is the ideological side that redefines what you are doing so that in doing it you are not a murderer, but performing a public service. The second cluster of questions had to do with esteem and the desire of the men to be held in high esteem by their comrades. So this is the group dynamic question. Were you considered tough? Were you admired by your comrades? Were you viewed as having done your share, of even doing more than your share? Were you a good leader and in a sense, carrying the weight of your duty and so forth? So what came out of this was exactly these two things, and both are essential components. One is a cultural or ideological framing of what you're doing, and the second was the group dynamic of this need and desire to be held in esteem by others and to turn killing into an admired profession of which you were valued and held in high regard for. So in that sense, I think we see these two poles at work as well that I think we see in 101 too.
How can we use this knowledge and understanding of group dynamics to minimise and eliminate right-wing extremism that's happening all over the world today?
Oh, now if I had an answer to that, I would patent it and put it in a bottle and sell it to everybody. I mean, this is of course a really difficult question, and if we sort of turn it into the inverse, that is, what do we know about rescuers and people that did not conform, people that kind of said no? And at least if we look, say, at the research of Hamatek, who did this wonderful book about rescuers in Poland, individual rescuers, people who on their own buck their neighbors, risk in fact denunciation from their neighbors to hide people. And she said one major characteristic they had was that they were nonconformists before the issue of rescue comes up. They had already learned to live by their own moral norm, not the moral norms of society around them. They'd already established habits of self-reliance, asserting their own moral autonomy, not simply trimming their sails to whatever was faddish and acceptable among other people. So that when put to the test, their instinctive, or their immediate reaction was one that, yes, I will help you. I mean, obviously, if you're in the middle of the night and a Jew knocks on your door, you've got a few seconds to make up your mind. And you either say, go away, or you decide to let them in. And in a sense, you have to have a predisposition that has put you into a situation where you're not afraid to act on your own moral autonomy. The difficulty, here is, of course, how do you train people to be nonconformists? Because the very act of training, of course, is an act of conformity. That to have people conform to nonconformity is a kind of oxymoron, and this is our difficulty. So when we get to to issues of what do we do about people, extracted, the opposite thing, why people not move to be altruistic, but instead are attracted to movements that are basically based on hate, resentment, and grievance, and desperate for a kind of sense of belonging that validates who they are by making everyone else inferior. We don't have a quick recipe for that. I think, first of all, we have to realize, what are the forces in contemporary society that are making some people that vulnerable. And to the extent that we can address that, that there's broad social problems out of which some people react to the extreme, and one can relieve those issues. I talked on Wednesday night last about the great uneven cost of globalization and the disparities between those in the American economy doing very well and the pockets of people who are doing very badly. And of course, I'd argue basically one area where Trump picked up what had formerly been Democratic votes was in those pockets of despair where they'd been ignored. Their feelings had been ignored. Their economic distress had been ignored. Insofar as one can have smart social policies politically that deal with that, you are trying to preempt the creation of situations where some of those will become attracted to extreme groups. We always raise the question, does Holocaust education help? Does being aware of what extreme movements have done in the past inoculate people? I'm not sure. I think certainly general society has to be aware. The worst thing is that we should coast through life oblivious to what the dangers are, and to think it couldn't happen here. I mean, part of writing a book that I did called Ordinary Men was to try to make people conscious of the fact that people like you and me in certain circumstances can indeed be enlisted to do very terrible things. And to not be aware of that is to be disarmed, is to face that problem without being adequately equipped to deal with it. Which I'm glad to say is one reason that the military academies in the US, in fact, have used the book at different times, and some police training have used the book. Because it is an attempt to make people aware of what can happen if you are not mentally prepared when you face one of those situations where you do have to make choices, and so it doesn't come to you in a sense. So in a sense, you have the mental framework which you can categorize what is happening and why you should be making one choice as opposed to another. I think more generally it's important for us to not have the arrogance that our whole society is so superior we would never do what the Germans did, because that, I think, also is a kind of path to bad results. So I spent my whole life in education, so obviously I think education is part of the answer. But I do realize it is not a silver bullet. We don't have a vaccine, an intellectual vaccine that can inoculate people from this. It is a kind of constant battle to wash our hands every day, and that we just do have to keep working at it.
I think that's an excellent note, actually, on which to finish. So thank you for bringing up that question. And Professor Browning is having his final lecture at Monash University on Wednesday at 7:30, which will be really interesting. It's lessons learned from the life of a historian. So that'll be quite insightful. So I'd like to thank you very much for today for your interesting, thought-provoking and stimulating session. Thank you for coming to the centre.
Thank you.